So moving up, this is what I really kind of want to talk about, really, moving up from the marathon to ultra. So I've put marathon there, but of course it doesn't have to be marathon. It can be half marathon. I really wouldn't recommend jumping from 5K, 10K straight to an ultra. Of course you can do if that really floats your boat. And I guess a lot would depend upon what your training volume looks like. You could be a 5 or a 10K who still runs 80 to 90 miles a week, but just fancies going a bit slower because you can't get any faster. And in that situation, if you're someone like that, then the move up to the longer distance wouldn't be such a shock. But if you're a typical kind of club runner does a few 5Ks, maybe your park run, and joins a 10K series and maybe throws in the odd half marathon during a year, then that might be a bit of a shock. What we tend to see is a traditional approach for most people is that you'll be somebody who runs maybe 2 or 3 or 4 marathons a year, possibly in the 100 marathon club, and you say, I really want to actually tackle on the next big boundary to me, which is the ultra running. So we kind of see that sort of approach that people naturally come from the longer endurance events and sort of progress up. And I guess if you think about it across the park, when you're a young lad, a young buck or a young lass, and you're quite fit and you've got all that muscular strength, pushing hard on a 5K or a 10K is relatively straightforward and relatively easy, and you can get faster and faster. But what we tend to see across the spectrum, and that even goes across an elite sport, is as the athlete gets older, they get just a little bit slower. So they tend to sort of gravitate naturally to longer and longer distances, which is why we kind of said earlier on that the average age of an ultra runner is now 42 years, whereas perhaps a marathon is going to be a good 5 to 10 years younger than that, perhaps. That's what we tend to see there. And often as well, you get people that maybe have had many years in sports, so maybe they've done triathlons and Ironman. And certainly one guy that I've coached through an ultra was a triathlete and had done Ironman, and I think he'd had a crack at a Deca Ironman before as well. So he's very keen to move into those longer distances, and of course maybe cyclists as well, so people who do longer time trial cycle events. My neck of the woods over here near York, we have a yearly 24-hour cycle race that goes right past my house, and so you get a lot of cyclists that don't mind enduring for long times as well, so they'll often shift over to that. And of course, typically what we see is they'll start with the shorter distances. That's your traditional approach. So you'll be a marathoner or a half marathoner maybe. You'll have got many years in endurance sport. You've either been a triathlete or a road runner cycling, and you're going to have eventually maybe in the first one you might go is for your 50K or your 30-miler or your 6-hour event. That tends to be the traditional kind of way of feeling your way into it. And it's a great option for many people because, of course, if you've done a marathon before, that's 26.2 miles or 42K. So the jump doesn't seem so massive when you go in from a marathon to an ultra. Although trust me, it feels a bit different when you are running that ultra marathon. If you think about your marathon, typically when you're getting towards the end, maybe the fatigue kicks in at 18 miles, maybe 20 miles. Suddenly you think, well, I've only got another 6 miles to go, or 5 miles or 4 miles as you're counting down a park run. If that kind of kicks in at 18 miles or 20 miles to go, you might be thinking, I've still got 12 or 10 miles to go, and it can be so demoralizing. So that's something to bear in mind. That extra 4 miles doesn't seem like a great deal in a 30 mile or less than 4 miles, but it can feel substantially different on the day. Then, of course, we have the non-traditional approach, and I've seen several people that follow this. It's one that we wouldn't specifically recommend, but of course, it's all about what the athlete's wants and needs are ultimately. So, we have to tailor, I guess, the training for the athlete's wants and needs. So, the typical kind of non-traditional approach we're talking about is that person that maybe is a 5K or a 10K. So never really done many long races and says, I'm going to just pop up to my local long ultra run. And of course, these are becoming more and more popular because we are getting these big community events as well. So such things as Thunder Run, Endure 24, the Spitfire Race, all of these kind of 24-hour races that where you can run as a team, so you can dabble your toes in it a little bit. So and I guess experience that, or you can run it as a solo if you want to as well. And it has that kind of Glastonbury of running sort of feeling. And you see a lot of people that maybe from the non-traditional approach will kind of venture into those kind of events first, because that's probably one that they can manage a little bit easier, because typically on those kind of things you have a route of 5 or 6 miles that you run round, and you can come back to your base camp and rest for a little bit if you want to, refuel up and then go out again. So it's really, really one to kind of bear in mind if you are sort of going from that shorter distances and up there. And we are seeing 1 or 2 people that are going straight into the longer ultra events. Again, it's not something that I would recommend, but I have personally myself, I've known three athletes that have jumped from half marathon straight up to 100-miler. And that is one heck of a jump. Of course, that has a big reflection on how they train for that, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the demands of training in the next couple of slides, I guess. The transition thing. So, as a coach, what do we do with athletes? With the athletes we work with, how do we transition? Well, the first thing is ask the athlete. If you're the athlete yourself and you're coaching yourself, you're self-coached, then ask yourself, have that honest conversation. What do I want? Why do I want to do this? What are my preferences? What's my history, my injury history, my training history, my work-life balance? These are all the key things that are going to really affect your ability to be successful at the ultra. And that's probably every other race to an extent, but probably more so in the ultra, because you're going to require a little bit more time training. And I guess if you don't have that honest conversation with yourself or with the athlete that you're working with, then you might try to take on an event that you're not really fully engaged for, or the athlete's not ready for. So, if you've got somebody who's got a real hankering to run the trails, and you say, right, we're going to put you on a 100-mile road ultra, well, he or she is probably not going to be fully engaged into the process. So you need to have that conversation with the athlete if you're the coach, or if you're self-coached, then have that conversation with yourself. What do I really want out of this? What are my preferences? Is it trail? Is it track? Is it road? Is it a combination of them? Do I want to do it in the UK? Do I want to do it abroad? These are all the kind of things you need to understand. And then once you kind of unpick all that kind of stuff, you can then sort of say, okay, so now we know what we like. Let's go find the race that's going to suit me and my preferences, or the athlete and his or her preferences. And like I said, for most people, they're going to start with maybe a couple of 50k races, or a 30-mile or a 6-hour race, and that gives you a real good opportunity to kind of discover and learn the demands of ultra running and ultra training, because the race itself is a small part of what you do. If you look at all the hours you spend training up into that ultra race, it's significant. So doing those shorter distances enables you to kind of learn a lot about yourself, and maybe sort of dabble your toes in without doing too much damage, because the worst thing you can do is jump straight from although I've seen athletes do that, jump straight from a half marathon or shorter up to a 50-miler or 100k, and you're going to find that quite a challenge, and you're going to have to discover all about nutrition, and you'll often discover it the very hard way. So that's something to really, really kind of think. You start with your shortest distances first, and then progress up. Once you kind of feel comfortable and confident, you've got a couple under your belt, you know what nutrition works for you, you know what kind of training volume you can cope with, you can then start saying, okay, so I'm now ready to progress from, say, a 50k to a 50-miler, or a 30-miler to a 50-miler, or even 100k. And then kind of, once you've got that nailed down, you can then start thinking, well, let's maybe look at a 100-miler. And once you've got that nailed down, you might then start thinking about, let's go for a competitive 24-hour race where I'm going to go beyond 100 miles in that 24 hours, hopefully, and see how much I can get, and that kind of stuff. So you kind of logically progress along if it makes sense to you. I guess for ultra runners as well, pace is critical, and that's something again that you learn. You can't tackle it as a marathon. Or a half marathon. You have to tackle it based upon the demands of the individual course you're running upon, because of course some are very flat, so a flat 50k or a 30-miler will feel a little bit harder than a marathon, so probably go a little bit slower than a marathon. But that's if it was a like-for-like course. If you were doing a hilly marathon, then actually you might be slower on that hilly marathon than you are on a flat 30 30 mile or a 50k. So you've got to really understand the demands of the course, and that's going to dictate a lot of your pacing as well as your aerobic fitness, your capacity to kind of keep going, and that running an economy that you'll develop over the training cycles. Nutrition and hydration is really key, I think, for success at ultra. One of the biggest issues that we see, one of the biggest reasons why people pull out of ultra races by far is GI issues, problems with the stomach, where they maybe just suddenly cannot take any more fuel on board. They start to vomit or start to run to the toilet, and for a sit-down toilet break, they really struggle. They can't get nutrition in. At that stage, they're losing not only the nutrition they're taking on board, but they're also losing valuable hydration as well. And of course, if you do get dehydrated, that's going to have a direct effect on your heart rate, and it's going to make things feel so much harder as well. And of course, you do need to have good quality hydration to actually absorb some of the nutrients you take inside as well. So if you're dehydrated, that in itself can affect your ability to absorb the nutrients and sort of transfer them into your body so you can have them as a usable energy source going forward. So that's kind of things to think about. Now, there's lots of discussions around being a fat adapted athlete. It's not really as simple as saying, right, okay, that's dropped carbohydrates, purely training the fat zone, because the body doesn't really work like that. We don't really have a switch like that. Yeah, sure. If you're running at 14-minute miles, you're probably a big chunk of your needed energy will be coming from your fat stores, but still a reasonable chunk will be coming from your carbohydrates. So when I see athletes sort of say, well, I'm dropping carbs and I'm just going to do a fat diet or a low carb, high fat diet, it always makes me worry a little bit, because of course, you are really restricting one potential energy source for your body there, and I think you've got to try and have it pretty balanced as much. In fact, I'd say try and have a little bit more carbohydrates than your fats in there. Even though you've got a lot of fat to burn, you're still going to be burning a big chunk of carbohydrates even at those lower paces. So it's worthwhile remembering that. And of course, in the race, if you suddenly have to go anaerobic and you've got no carbs in your body, well, I'm sorry, fats won't burn anaerobically. So you need your carbs. So you won't have that ability to push really hard when you have to. So you might be, in the middle of getting towards the back end of your race, and it's getting quite competitive, and you've got a real ding dong going on with a couple of races around you. And suddenly you come to a steep climb and they push a little bit. If you've not got the carbohydrates inside you, you may struggle to react to that kind of move in a race. So it's worthwhile remembering that, and sort of being mindful as well when you are taking on fluids as well, to watch out that you don't take excessive fluids. So, we say at one point you need fluids, but you don't need too much, because hypernatremia in itself can be a big problem there, and obviously starts watering down. You're losing your salts as you're sweating, so you start watering down a lot more, so you need to replace your salts with some good quality sodium or electrolytes, that kind of stuff. You also need to be quite specific in your race prep and your training. So there's very little point in me, where I live, it's flatlands. I live not too far from the Yorkshire Wolds, but it's pretty flat. So if I was going to race a hilly race, there'd be very little point in me just doing my local 10-mile loop around my village and the surrounding village, because it's pancake flat, and it would do me very little benefit. Yes, I'd get some cardiovascular fitness, but when it comes to race day and that first climb comes, and all of a sudden I'm going to detonate a little bit and be shocked. So when you are sort of preparing yourself for the race, think about the race profile. What kind of environment is you running? So if you're running on a track, for argument's sake, make sure you spend a little bit of time running for a long time on a track, because you're going to have to experience that kind of monotony, and you're going to have to be ready to cope with that. So if you can do that in your training, be prepared for it. If it's a hilly race that's got a lot of climbing, make sure that you have some of that in your training. Conversely, if it's also got a heck of a lot of descent, so maybe you're going to really batter your quads on the way down, make sure you factor some of that into your training. If it's road, if it's trail, all these things you need to factor into your training to make sure you do actually make it quite specific to the course that you're doing. Now, initially, I'd say just focus on getting that aerobic base there, and then as your training progresses, you're then going to build a good block of maybe 6 to 8 weeks where you're going to be very, very focused on being sort of race specific. So bringing in that extra stimulus that you're going to face on race days. That's kind of a key thing that that you need to do. Another thing to think as well, if it's a 24-hour race, so maybe you're going to be doing a race that's running overnight, maybe a multi-day event, and you're planning to run for 36 hours without taking much sleep. In that situation, you're also going to have to train your body to cope with that a little bit, and yourself mentally as well. So there you're going to have to, factor in maybe one or two of your runs are going to be done in the wee hours of the morning, just so you can get yourself used to that feeling of running when it's dark with the head torch on, what it feels like on a similar kind of route that you're going to go on. Of course, it's going to be quite challenging if it's a trail route and you've got the head torch on. You're going to have to watch out for all sorts of additional stumps and stuff like that. But it's better to learn that skill in your training phase whilst you're training for your race, as opposed to find out the hard way on race day that suddenly you put your head torch on because it's got to dusk, it's getting dark, you're going up a hilly trail somewhere, and suddenly you're really struggling because you're not used to running in that environment or that way. So be very mindful about that in your race preparation.